All right, thanks so very much, guys. And we're going to get into a subject now with Jordan Graft, who is the CEO of Highway, joining us here from Dallas, Texas. And Jordan, we're going to talk about cargo theft. And this is a very, very interesting subject. In fact, when you got to me earlier and said, this is what I want to talk about, I was elated when the subject came up, because we had people mentioning this very subject earlier this week. It's kind of come to a head. It's not something we talk about very much, but it's certainly something that needs to be addressed. First off, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Bill. Hey, Thomas. How you guys doing? Good to talk with you.
Thanks for being here as well. All right, so let's go. First off, what's going on? What are you seeing, and what are those that are, say, for instance, bad actors trying to do in this situation?
Yeah, so I thought the article that you all published was really great. The only thing was the headline photo of it, where the guy's cutting the lock off the trailer and he has the ski mask on. Is it really a realistic of what's happening out there, right? So, obviously they're finding ways to get inside the networks of shippers and carriers. And once in the network, whether they're masquerading as another carrier or they've set themselves up under authority they've created, they're finding ways to get a hold of the load and take it. And once they have possession of it, right, then it's in their possession. They can do with it whatever they want. I think the most important things that were kind of highlighted in the article and that we see is that this isn't one-off activity. Right. These are groups working together using consistent. And the way we know that is using consistent techniques for trying to find their way into the networks of brokers. That's what we see, primarily brokers, but I know they're going after shippers as well. We see patterns in how they try and where they're trying to operate geographically, what loads they're trying to find and what lanes they're trying to work. And some of that has to do with, if you think about this is a physical activity where you have a truckload of product, you're going to have to move it somewhere where you have a warehouse that you control to be able to offload this amount of product, right? When they're doing it at this scale. So they're operating, and the article talked about California, Texas, and Florida. They're operating in markets where they have physical locations where they can stage this inventory, right? So, I think those trends are really important for us to think about because it's like a risk matrix, right? You got to think about where you're moving cargo. You got to think about your relation to the carrier and their experience with you, but then also you got to think about risk factors that you may see around fraudulent activity as you're engaging with your network.
And kind of digging into that, I think it was real fascinating. I think it was $223 million worth of product was lost in 2022. Is this a situation where, I remember running HVP 200 miles without stopping, making sure for high value products. Are there any pragmatic steps carriers and even shippers can take to try and reduce this risk? Or is it more of a situation where if you end up in large places, Miami, Atlanta, California, like LA and Dallas, you just have to be on guard? Are there any pragmatic steps to kind of reduce the chance that your trailers are the one?
Yeah, I think the risk is definitely different for the carrier, the broker, and the shipper. But let's talk about carrier and broker because that's where we spend most time. So for carriers, the risk that we're seeing for them right now is, first, their identity is getting stolen at scale that hasn't happened in ever, right? There's hundreds of attempts every day for bad actors trying to steal the identity of a carrier, represent themselves as a carrier that they're not to a broker, and that's primary risk number one for a carrier, because you talk about reputation damage, you're talking about potential claims back to them because their identity was represented to receive a load. The second risk for a carrier is engaging with a broker who's actually double brokering. It's not just co-brokering or something like that. They're really trying to fraudulently defraud them and not pay them, and that's where we see probably the biggest gap today. There's tools out there for brokers to kind of profile carriers and see hey, is this carrier real? Do they really have equipment? And people like Highway and Carrier 411 and others provide those services to brokers, but carriers are really struggling with, hey, I see this load, it's been made available to me, this person does have broker authority, I've never worked with them, my factor gave me a credit line on them. There was a video going around TikTok of a carrier who almost got ripped off on a situation. So for a carrier, those are the two primary risks, in my opinion, is their identity being compromised And then second is getting financial risk by engaging with a double broker who they think is a good actor.
Jordan, when you look at, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, so looking at the situation where, yeah, I know we've got a bit of delay and we got to figure it out. So looking at the situation, obviously there is the physical act of stealing a trailer. Obviously, as you mentioned, say for instance, just getting a hold of the truck, getting a hold of the trailer itself. There's also, for instance, as you mentioned, these are larger groups. Maybe we're doing, how are we working on the internet? How are we trying to perhaps maybe even crack a database, trying to figure out where our load goes? How does the scam work?
Yeah, so the most common, let's talk about the two most common. The first is stealing a carrier's identity. What they're doing is it's a social hack, it's social engineering. They're emailing a carrier sales rep with an email address and saying, hey, I am the carrier. They're trying to make that email address look as close to the email address of the carrier as possible so that, a carrier sales rep moving really, really quick doesn't notice the difference between the email address that's sending them the email and what is actually posted in, say, Carrier 411 or Highway or in the census websites. So now once they're in, if they can get into the network and they can get rate confirmations dispatched to them, maybe they're presenting it as a carrier that's already in that broker's network, right? That carrier's already in that broker's TMS, is onboarded and good to go. And if they're able now to grab that rate confirmation in the bill of lading, that's all they need. And that's all they have to do, is they have to find a way into the inbox of a carrier sales rep and potentially just happen to land on a carrier that's already passed through a process, or be able to onboard as that carrier if the broker allows the carrier, whoever to just onboard as any carrier. Then now once they have that rate con and bill of lading, they're in.
And thinking about on the brokerage side, double brokering, I remember when I was a broker, I'd heard stories of double broker rings around, I think it was Glendale, California, like a very extensive operation where people were forging multiple authorities. Are there clusters of areas, if you see some that you need to watch out for as a carrier on these load boards, or is double brokering kind of a nationwide, it could be across the board issue?
Yeah, I think you got to break it into the double brokering we're talking about is sophisticated actors working to obtain loads from brokers and to get other motor carriers to run those loads, promising to pay that carrier, and then running that balance up as fast as possible, and then taking off. That's as we're talking about. Most people, when they say double brokering, are talking about that specific sophisticated act. It is 100% operating in rings. There are groups that are trained. They use the consistent techniques. They use consistent tactics. They use consistent, we don't want to give too much away about how we identify them, but they use consistent ways of doing business. And so you're able to pick up on those patterns and find them. And so Glendale and Southern California was and still is a key area of activity. But they're evolving, right? They're going to continue to evolve and use new tactics. Once we all, everyone that's been in brokerage for a while knows that, right? And so now we're seeing, like you just said, they're moving to other areas and centers, or making us feel like they're moving to other areas and centers to get away from people profiling on what we know as activities. So it's a continuous evolving system, an organism, and you got to try and stay ahead of them, because there's a lot of money in this. There's a lot of money. Talking with, the TriPay, Tim Valdez and Melissa Foreman over there, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars are flowing to these entities. And so it's big business. It's not small. Like, this is a big industry, a big, when there's lots of money flowing to something, it's going to energize it and keep giving it life. And so we got to shut that off.
Jordan, let me ask you a very big question, give you about 60 seconds to answer it, just because it is. We had some people earlier on this week actually talking about the fact that, when you get into, freight being stolen, that some people argue, well, that's just a commercial issue. The carrier, the broker, they need to handle that. That's a law enforcement issue. Others would say it's a safety issue. For instance, if you have food that gets stolen and then all of a sudden you have an outbreak of something, where do you come down on how this needs to be managed, either from an industry level or, again, more on a smaller level, to the carrier, to the broker?
All right, let's talk about stolen cargo separate of double brokering.
Okay.
My goal on the double brokering side and working on that piece is to work with groups, and we're all working with groups on going after that as like wire fraud and a financial crime, right? You're representing, there's really powerful laws about misrepresenting what you're doing, business activity, and that one I think we can attack that way. The cargo is much more complicated by state level, and I think it's going to even require state agency level, like state law enforcement getting involved. I don't think you're going to be able to do that at a federal level unless, I just don't see that happening at a federal level on the cargo side.
Nevertheless, a very, very difficult issue to handle there. Jordan Graft, CEO of Highway, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Thomas.
All right. This is just a massive issue, and it's something that we don't necessarily talk about that much, but it's got to be addressed at some point.
Exactly. There's way too much opportunity right now, and it can get, when it happens to you, I've actually had double brokers before. You just don't know, and the next thing you know, they don't pay for 60 days, and it seemed legit, and now you're out like $1,500 to $2,000. So not fun at all.
Absolutely. Well, we'll take a break. We'll come up with more FreightWaves Now right after this.